With right sides facing each other and matching the notches, pin the front bodice to the front of the sleeve piece. Stitch this front sleeve seam at your regular 2.5 stitch length and at 1 cm seam allowance. Finish off the raw edges with your preferred method. And then press the seam allowances towards the sleeves. Pin the back bodice pieces to the back sleeve pieces. The back does not have any notches. Stitch these seams and then once again finish your raw edges and press them towards the sleeves. With right sides facing, pin your back and front facings at the shoulder seams. Stitch these seams and then press it open. Using your longest stitch length, sew a line of basting stitches 1 cm from the long edge of the facing. Using these basting stitches as a guide, you can now press the raw edge up towards the wrong side. In order to complete the neat construction of the button band, the back facing is intentionally shorter. Pin the back facing to the back bodice pieces at the center back seam only. Stitch the center back facing at your 1 cm seam allowance. Clip the corners and grade the seams to reduce bulk. Press the seam you just made open. Then press fold line 1 towards the wrong side of each back piece. Once the button bands are folded under, you can see now that the facings fit the neckline perfectly. Now we're going to attach the facing to the neckline, so we're going to line up all the notches. You have a notch on your back facing that lines up with the back sleeve seam on your bodice. As you can see, this then pulls in fold line 2. Now you can pin this whole area, making sure that you're folding it at fold line 2. The shoulder seam on your facing is going to line up with the shoulder notch on your sleeve. You've then also got a notch on your facing that lines up with the front sleeve seam on your bodice. This is where the center front notches that we made earlier comes into play. We're now matching those notches, the center front of the facing with the center front of the bodice. When you're pinning the sleeve seam notches, just make sure that you're pinning your seam allowance, that it's still facing towards the sleeve. Now we're going to sew right around the neck band with your normal stitch length at 1 cm seam allowance. Clip the corners to reduce bulk. At the back bodice hem, we're going to fold it at fold line 2, and then placing right sides together, we're going to pin the button stand down. Stitch your hem at 1.5 centimeters if you want the desired 1/4 inch folded hem. This is a double folded hem, so whichever width you want your hem to be, you need to stitch double that. Stitch only across the button stand and then clip the corners to reduce bulk. We are now going to stitch our side seams. With right sides together, match up the side seams, making sure that you line up the stitch line of your underarm sleeve seams. Pin both your side seams. And then stitch it, taking care to pivot at the angle of the sleeve hem. Finish off your raw edges and then press the seam towards the back. Using a long stitch length, sew a line of basting stitches at 1.5 centimeters from the hem edge. If you've decided to have a different hem width, then stitch it at the same seam allowance as what you did on the button stand previously. Press your hem seam allowance up towards the wrong side so that the raw edge meets your basting stitch line. Now we're going to turn out the bottom hem corner towards the right side. You can use a point turner to get a nice sharp corner. As you can see, the hem now wants to lie in the right position. So we're going to press that last fold down. Turn the top of your button stand right side out. Press your neckline seam allowances towards the facing in preparation for understitching. You won't be able to get right to the corner to start your understitching, so I'm starting mine at the seam we created where the back facing meets the back button stand. Backstitch and then sew as close to the seam on the facing side as possible, making sure that your seam allowance is always on the facing side. By sewing the facing to the seam allowance, it makes it want to naturally roll to the wrong side, which means the right side will have a very clean finish. Backstitch again when you reach that same back facing seam. A tiny bit of understitching is showing on the right side of the garment. So I'm just taking a few moments to remove those stitches so it doesn't show. Now you can either choose to braid and then clip your seam allowances, or what I like to do on curves like this is use a pinking shears. That really makes the seam very flexible and it lies nice and flat. As you can see, the understitching is curling nicely towards the wrong side. Just think about the direction that it's going to be feeding through your machine and then put the pins in the right direction so that you can just pull them out. Now, taking one section at a time, we're just going to lay that piece of the neckline flat and then steam it in place and pin it. And then once again, just line it up nicely, just that one section. And steam it in place and then pin it. A tailor's ham is very helpful with this step. It just helps you to mold a curve. Now if you want to top stitch from the right side, you can just place your pins on the right side and make sure it's catching the back. You can also measure what your seam allowance needs to be when you are top stitching, because you won't be able to see the edge of your facing. I prefer to see what I'm doing and I like to stitch from the wrong side right on the edge. We are going to top stitch all along the hem, the neckline and the button stands. So if you're doing this from the right side, your stitches will probably look a tiny bit neater because the bobbin stitch is ever so slightly slanted. So this is completely personal preference, but as I say, I like to stitch right on the edge, so I like to do it from the wrong side. This is what the right side looks like, and I'm pretty happy with that. Now you can either stitch all the way up this button stand, or you can just do what I'm doing and I'm just carrying on and pivoting there and then carrying on with the neckline. As you're sewing the neckline, you are sewing a very deep curve now, so just keep on shifting your fabric and moving it so that the section that you're stitching is laying straight. Now before I start the sleeve, please take note that there is a section on the sleeve hem towards the end of this video. The timestamps will be in the description box below. If you prefer not to sew the angled hem, then please check out that section. So when I'm sewing a curve like this, I like to get the fabric into the mood for easing. What you can do is just hold the fabric at the back, and what that does is it crowds the fabric at the back of the presser foot. And it's making a series of ripples, like little creases, and that really helps the fabric just to, like I say, get into the mood for molding and gathering. So we stitched a basting stitch at 1 centimeter, and now we're going to stitch another line of basting stitches at 4 centimeters. I'm marking my seam allowance with a piece of tape, and once again I'm just holding the fabric at the back. Technically you don't need it here on this basting line because essentially this is just a guideline as to where to fold your fabric. I find it still helps the fabric to mold and fold over, but this is just my personal preference. If you prefer, you can just sew this straight as you would any other seam. Now we're going to be pressing that 1 centimeter under. If you are going to be pulling on the gathering stitches now, the only thing that will result in is a twisted hem. So what the angle does is it takes care of some of the gathering that's in this section here by the actual sleeve seam. So most of the gathering that needs to happen is on the top fuller part of the sleeve. That means if you're going to start to gather now from the ends of the gathering threads, it's going to twist this section of the hem. So what I'm doing is I'm measuring just over 3 centimeters. I like to give myself a little bit of room because sometimes I find that if my stitching isn't 100% accurate, then the casing ends up being a tiny bit too small in some areas. So I'm measuring 3.25 centimeters. Okay, so at this point we're not doing any gathering yet. We are just concentrating on taking section by section, measuring the casing and pinning it down. Now as you can see, the part that's by the angle is lying completely flat. If you gather that bit, it's going to twist. So all you need to do is just seam that down. You don't need to gather it. Now as we start moving up, you see there's excess fabric. So we're just going to take one section at a time and just gather that one section. Just take your pin and grab the gathering stitch and slightly pull it. And then you're just going to distribute that all of those little gathers in that one section. Now, like with any gathering, you're just going to move it until you're happy with it. And once you are happy with it, you can steam that section down and pin it. Just a note on pins and pressing. My pins are glass head pins. If you have plastic head pins, the plastic will melt under your iron. So if you only have plastic head pins, then you can remove the pins, steam it, and then pin it again. If you do have a few little tucks, don't bother about it, because once it's all gathered into the elastic casing, then there's no way you're going to see any tiny folds. Now, to help you remember to keep a gap open to feed your elastic through, you can just mark a 5cm gap with pins. Just place 2 pins on either side of the gap, and then you'll remember to start and stop at the 2 pins. I'm just giving my hem a nice final press. It helps if you have like a tailor's clapper or something like that. I don't own one, so I just use my sleeve roll, and that just absorbs a bit of the steam and helps set the crease. Removing the extension table of your machine helps you to move easily around the curve. Now, sew as close to the edge as you possibly can all around the sleeve hem, leaving that 5cm gap. Remove both lines of basting stitches. The pattern does include a recommended elastic length. You can also just put the elastic around your arm and sort of roughly see what length you want your elastic to be. Or once your elastic is inserted and before you close the gap, you can also put on your garment and test if it's the right length for you. The tighter your elastic is going to be, the more volume your sleeve will have. So I just measured the elastic on my sister-in-law's arm and asked her where it was feeling comfortable, and so we decided to go with a 37cm elastic. Attach the end of your elastic with a safety pin and then start feeding the safety pin and the elastic through your casing. You can secure the other end of your elastic with a pin or a safety pin. Just make sure as you feed it that you're keeping the elastic flat and not twisting it. Now take the 2 ends of your elastic, making sure that the elastic's not twisted, and you're going to sew that together. You can either overlap the 2 ends and then sew them flat. I just automatically went with my go-to method, which is sewing it together like this. And then I trim the one end, and then I fold the elastic open and flat and put the longer end over the shorter end to conceal the raw edge. And then I just do a zigzag stitch along the longer raw edge. Now you can feed the elastic ends through the casing, and then you're going to sew the gap closed. Make sure the fabric is gathered nicely all the way around the elastic, and if you need to flatten out the elastic or just twist it a bit so it's lying completely flat within the casing. Now, to keep the elastic flat so that it doesn't twist while you're wearing it, we're just going to stitch in the ditch on that seam line, and then on the opposite side we're going to do a line of stitching as well. Mark the buttonholes on the left side of the back bodice. I just cut out my buttonhole markings like a little stencil, and then I'm going to use that and my friction pen to mark the buttonholes. And then make your buttonholes according to your placement markings. Now you can either cut open your buttonholes using a buttonhole cutter, or if you don't have one of those, you can just use your seam ripper. I would recommend starting at the one end and then ripping to the middle, and then starting at the other end and ripping to the middle again, because you don't want to rip straight through the end of your buttonhole. I like to snip off any extra little strands that came loose while I was cutting open my buttonhole. And then I apply just a little bit of fray check. This always dries clear, but if you're not certain how it will pair with your fabric, then just test it on a little scrap first. Now you can use your buttonhole to mark the placement for your button on the other button stand. Using a hand sewing needle and thread, you can sew on your buttons. I like to use a double thread. If you do want to eliminate the button bands, then you're just going to have to find the center back. Like the front of the bodice, you're going to want to cut it on the fold. If you take the sleeve piece, you'll see that the sleeve actually makes up a portion of the neckline. If we think about the construction and the way the button band is going to be folded back, the center back would be in the center of that button band, where the buttons and buttonholes meet, because of course the two are going to overlap. This in its bigger form is 2 centimeters. So the center back is going to be half of that. So we just need to take 1 centimeter away. And now we're going to cut it out on center back. And now we've got our on the fold piece. Now, because the back facing is actually already shorter, the technique used to finish off the back facing is really neat, but it does require the facing to be shorter. So this is an advantage actually, because it makes that this back facing doesn't need any alterations if you cut the back on the fold. And then of course the last thing you're going to need to do is just make your little on the fold markings so that you remember that the back facing as well as the back needs to be cut on the fold. You might like the button detail, but you might not like doing buttonholes. What you're going to do is you're just going to take your back piece, you're going to sew everything as normal, and you're just going to sew the buttons right through both layers of the button band. So you can still see the buttons, but there's no buttonholes. It's just secured, so it's not functional buttons. In most things in sewing, there are quite a few different techniques to come to the same end. For instance, if you look at the angled hem of the sleeve, as most sewing techniques, it does have its pros and its cons. So the big pro to this, and why some people like it, is because it takes care of almost all of the easing that needs to happen in this area over here and over here. So the main part of the easing that you have to do and the gathering is in this fuller part over here. If you've done an angled hem before and you don't like it, the reason might be because if you fold it up for those angles to meet, you'll find that it has the tendency to want to twist slightly over here. The simple fix is even out this hem. Now what you could also do, of course, is keep all of that volume and just lengthen this and put an extra bit there. And so what this is going to do is when you turn up the hem, there's not going to be any of that twisting, but you are going to have to do an additional bit of easing in the entirety of the hem. So this is completely a personal preference. Just decide what works best for you. Now there are of course other options that you could do to even eliminate doing any easing in a curved hem. One of them being a facing. If you've got a lightweight fabric, I wouldn't recommend this for heavier like a linen for instance, because there'll be a bit too much bulk in the seam allowance. So what you could do is you could just make a pattern piece for a facing, and your facing needs to be 3 centimeters so that the elastic can fit in, and then of course you're going to be adding seam allowance to that, so you're going to be adding 1 centimeter on each side. So the depth of your facing would then end up being 5 centimeters. Now this is already drafted to add that amount that you fold up. So if you want the same length sleeve than what the design is intended for, then you're going to have to remove the 3 centimeters that needs to be turned up. Now of course there's 4 centimeters that turns up because you turn in 1 centimeter, then you turn up 3 centimeters. But you want to keep that 1 centimeter for your seam allowance because you're going to need something for your facing to be attached to. So this will allow you to maintain a very smooth curve, but do realize that it's going to add a little bit of bulk to it. So that's one option. Another option, of course, is to just use a thinner elastic, because the less you have to turn up, the less gathering there needs to be. So I found with a 1 centimeter elastic, it was actually really easy to just turn up, and it didn't need gathering stitches. Just the steam from my iron sorted out the easing for me. So I would suggest you then straighten out this seam over here, and then you simply just go to your iron and start turning up and steaming. This is an extremely easy pattern, and this sleeve hem might be the only part that is a little bit tricky. So if you do find it tricky, then you can choose whichever method that you prefer to do.